Stacey, I want to start with you. What did you learn?
I think I was surprised by how quickly things escalated and the fact that the blue team didn't really seem to believe the red team's threats about nuclear use. That didn't seem to be honored. It seemed to me that they thought that they were bluffing and they were willing to call that bluff.
Joel, I would say that the plan going in, I remember you explaining to me, we're going to go in quickly. We're going to go in with big force, and we're going to end this quickly. That didn't happen.
Well, the Americans put up a fight. We sacrificed a lot. I was unsatisfied that we weren't able to take out Taiwan's president early in the game, and so we had to move harder throughout the game. We paid a big price, but ultimately, I don't think we lost. I think we got the foothold that we wanted, and we'll get the prize, but we will have paid an enormous cost in blood and treasure to have gotten it.
Bonnie, the decision to target Japan, is that going to be, assuming this war gets drawn out in this scenario, is that going to be an initial mistake or miscalculation from the red team or the Chinese side?
I don't see that as a miscalculation. One of the things that we discussed during the team is of the U.S. allies and partners, which U.S. ally or partner we knew would be involved in the conflict. And we were most certain that regardless of what the scenario was, if it was a crisis or major conflict in Taiwan, Japan would be there to support the United States. So for us, the calculation was, do we want to take out the assets in Japan now while they're still relatively easier to target, or do we want to wait later when it was much more difficult to strike Japan, and knowing either way that Japan would be in the fight with the United States.
So they went with a preemptive strike, essentially, on Japan. You guys debated, and it's my understanding there was a little bit of debate on that first move. Should the U.S. side be more aggressive? Explain.
Well, obviously, I think particularly if China's pursuing a fait accompli strategy, the quicker that goes, the more they're actually able to establish facts on the ground in Taiwan, the more difficult it is for us to react to that, right? The same thing that makes Taiwan a difficult problem geographically for the Chinese to solve makes it very difficult for us to resupply. So if we weren't going to do a preemptive strike because we wanted the moral authority that came from responding to an attack on us, we at least wanted to be ready to start taking out their ships while they were in port, while they were transiting across the strait. And I think, the lesson for me is just how costly deterrence failures are. We've become accustomed to sort of low-intensity conflict over the last 2 decades. If this happens, a lot of people are going to lose their life, which is why we want deterrence to actually work, and which is why we need hard power in place prior to the conflict breaking out.
Mickey Sherrill, when I hear some other country has air superiority over anything, we're the United States of America, but obviously we're a lot closer to their mainland there. That was, to me, a surprise that we could not establish air superiority over Taiwan.
Well, certainly, I think what we've been so concerned about on the House Armed Services Committee is the fact that we see China's growing predominance in certain areas and catching up very, very quickly to what had been for decades really presumed superiority in military matters by the United States. And what was so helpful to both of us was to be at the table for this war game so that when we do make decisions for this country, when we are looking at how we modernize our military and where we strategically use the taxpayer resources that we're given most effectively, that we're thinking about how to really, as Mike said, how to make sure this never happens. How do we make sure that we are able to present such a credible threat across the world that we never actually have to go into a hot war like this?
Bonnie, you were saying one thing we just don't know is what the Chinese, what the red team derived the decision-making process was through the writings of the army, of the Chinese army, and you were very, stuck to that script. What do you suspect they are going to take away from Russia's essentially failed attempt to do what the Chinese strategy for your Chinese strategy to do here was, which is to take Taiwan quickly? That was the Russian strategy. It didn't work for them, and it didn't work for the Chinese.
So I think China looks at what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and they don't see the Russian failure as directly applicable to the PLA because of the differences in how Russia invaded Ukraine versus how China plans for Taiwan. So one thing I think China is going to take away is, exactly like what we did with the war game, was China's going to try to move much faster on Taipei, decapitation, and concentrate its forces on Taipei. One other thing that China is taking away is the extent to which Russia's nuclear signaling deterred the United States and NATO from going into Ukraine. Ukraine. So I don't think the Chinese necessarily are confident that nuclear weapons will deter the United States from intervening to help Taiwan, but China is going to invest in its nuclear capabilities and will likely play up nuclear signaling in the Taiwan conflict.
You know, Joel, Michelle Flournoy told me after one of the debriefs, after one of the moves, that she was surprised that the Chinese fired the first shot at first, meaning her assumption was they would just slowly move their ships, basically go as close as they could without ever firing a shot. And then all of a sudden, what are we going to do? They're at the front door of Taiwan.
Well, I think in reality what would happen is that China may indeed use a large-scale exercise as the cover for an actual invasion, much as Russia has tried to do this. I also think that China will be better at Russia. I think they will do large-scale exercises year over year over year and make it very difficult for us in the U.S. side to determine what is an exercise and what would be the actual invasion. That being said, from our point of view, we have to establish air and maritime superiority, which means that we have to fire the first shot.
Stacey, what is the idea that I feel like we're very familiar with Russia's aspiration to use tactical nukes. Where are the Chinese right now actually on this front? And obviously in 5 years they aspire to be better at it. But do they think that you can use nukes tactically?
Other people at this table are probably better positioned to answer this than me, but no, their doctrine is explicitly no first use. But a lot of people are beginning to question that because their nuclear posture is changing and they're expanding their arsenal so much. They're building new nuclear weapons and new types of weapons where some of those medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles that they used in the game, they can also carry nuclear warheads.
So my biggest takeaway, and I want to save this last question for the two of you because you're the elected officials. You're going to have to try to do this. We need an Asian NATO. It is pretty clear we need one. You know, look at all of the assets we have to tap into right now to help Ukraine. And so quickly, whether it's Slovakia, whether it's in Poland, there's not as many assets. That's what I learned from this. Can we do it?
Well, certainly we have a lot of friends in the Indo-PACOM region. And we spoke about some of our allies today, and I think there were some other allies in the region that maybe would have been a bit more helpful than was presented in the scenario.
Korea would be
South Korea.
The biggest one, yeah.
But I do think there's a discussion to be had about about doing more outreach here, doing more diplomacy here. There has been a hesitancy because of China's economic predominance. I'm wondering now, as we look at what's just happened with Ukraine, if some of our allies in the region aren't more willing to become to form a stronger partnership with each other and with the United States to ensure that they don't face some of these threats.
You know, Mike Gallagher, I go back to the decision by both essentially leaders of the political parties in 2016 to walk away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This was going to be essentially what could have been step one in creating a Western or a small d democratic umbrella in Asia. We didn't do it. Is it possible to, how do we do it now?
Well, we may have to start with certain bilateral agreements and put aside sort of the economic agreements. I think we have an urgent need for more basing agreements in the region. And that became very apparent throughout the war game. We had 3 treaty allies that were involved in the conflict, but we still struggled to project power where we needed to project it. We quickly in the game clarified the policy of strategic ambiguity. We suggested that the president make it explicit that we would defend Taiwan. That's something we need to re-examine in Congress, I think, very quickly, because we can't wait 2 weeks, 3 weeks if Congress isn't in session to have the debate and potentially give the president the authority he needs to defend Taiwan. So there are ways we can make progress, even though a big regional trade agreement is probably not likely in the short term.
Well, I have to say, this was fascinating. I learned a lot, and I hope some of the knowledge I learned we never have to actually use on air. No offense, guys. But thanks for making us a bit smarter.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.